In 1717, a British naval officer named Edward Braithwaite boarded a captured pirate vessel off the coast of Hispaniola and wrote something in his log that historians still argue about today. He expected to find a lawless mob, drunken savages who lived only to kill, steal, and terrorize. Instead, what he discovered was a meticulously written document nailed to the mast. It was a contract, signed by every single man on that ship. It outlined their wages, their rights, compensation for injuries, and rules for settling disputes. Braithwaite wrote, "I have never seen such order among the king's own sailors." He then hanged them all. But before he did, he kept a copy of that document. Because even he understood something extraordinary had been built on that ship. That document was called the ship's articles, and it was not unusual. Nearly every pirate vessel in the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, operated under one. These were not suggestions. They were binding agreements negotiated and voted on by the entire crew before anyone set sail. Lose your right hand in combat? 600 pieces of 8. Lose a leg? 800. For context, a skilled craftsman in London at the time earned around 60 pieces of 8 in a full year of honest work. Pirates had invented, essentially by accident, the world's first workplace disability insurance. And they did it over a century before any European government would consider such a thing. This is not the story you were told. The pirates of Hollywood, the ones with parrots and eye patches and dramatic speeches about treasure, those pirates barely existed. The real ones were something stranger, more complicated, and in many ways far more interesting. They were men and occasionally women who had been discarded by the world and had decided to build a new one, out at sea, on their own terms, with their own laws, their own economies, and their own brutal kind of justice. The first thing you need to understand about pirate crews is who was actually on them. When British and Spanish authorities captured pirate ships in the early 1700s, they expected to find criminals, deserters, the worst of the worst. And yes, those were there. But so were former Navy officers who had been stripped of rank for refusing to flog their men, escaped enslaved Africans who had jumped ship in the Caribbean and had nowhere on land that would take them, disgraced doctors, bankrupt merchants, runaway indentured servants. One account describes a crew that included a former tax collector who had embezzled from the crown, a French violinist, and 3 brothers from a fishing village in Portugal who had never intended to become pirates at all. Their boat simply got captured, and joining seemed better than the alternative. Approximately 25 to 30% of pirates during the Golden Age were black men, not as slaves or servants, as full crew members with equal voting rights and equal shares of plunder. Some rose to positions of serious authority. Some commanded their own vessels. In an era when slavery defined the entire Atlantic economy, when a black man in any port city in the Americas was presumed to be property, pirate ships were among the only spaces where this did not automatically apply. This was not idealism. Pirates couldn't afford to be selective. They needed bodies, skills, fighters. But the practical result was something that wouldn't exist in the legitimate world for another 200 years. Women were rarer, but not absent. Anne Bonny and Mary Red are the famous names. Both sailed with Calico Jack Rackham in the early 1720s. Both were captured in 1720 when British authorities raided their ship in the waters off Jamaica. The male crew members were reportedly found below deck, drinking. Bonnie and Reed were on deck, fighting. Mary Reed was reportedly so fierce in battle that a man she had a dispute with challenged her to a duel, and she killed him. When captured and brought to trial, both women were sentenced to hang. Both announced they were pregnant, which delayed their executions. Mary Reed died in prison shortly after, likely of fever. Anne Bonny disappears from the historical record entirely. What happened to her, no one knows. None of these people, the disgraced officers, the escaped slaves, the women fighters, the Portuguese fishermen who just wanted to go home, none of them chose piracy the way you might choose a career. They stumbled into it through desperation, capture, or the slow realization that the world they had been born into had already decided what they were worth. For many, the answer was nothing. Piracy, for all its brutality, offered something the legitimate world did not: a say in your own fate, a vote. The democratic structure of pirate ships is one of the genuinely startling things about them. Royal navies of the era operated on a principle of absolute hierarchy. The captain was God. He could flog, imprison, or execute. Common sailors had no recourse, no rights, no voice. The result was predictable. Desertion rates were catastrophic, morale was usually terrible, and mutiny was a constant threat that the officers managed through fear alone. Pirates had watched this system up close, many of them from the inside, and they had concluded that it was inefficient. So they built something different. On a pirate ship, the captain was elected. He served at the pleasure of the crew and could be voted out, sometimes in the middle of a voyage, sometimes during a battle, if the men felt he had made the wrong call. His authority was real but conditional. He commanded in combat, made tactical decisions during the hunt, set the course. But off the battlefield, he had one vote, the same as the youngest man aboard. The real day-to-day power lay with the quartermaster, another elected position, who managed provisions, distributed work, settled disputes, and held the crew's share of plunder. This separation of powers on a ship in 1700 was not an accident. It was deliberate. One of the most well-documented examples of pirate democracy in action involves Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate in history. His crew captured over 400 vessels in a career that lasted just 4 years. In 1718, Roberts wanted to attack a Portuguese treasure fleet off the coast of Brazil. The fleet was heavily armed, escorted by warships, and the attack would be extraordinarily dangerous. His crew voted against it. Roberts, despite his fearsome reputation, despite being the man who had essentially built this crew from nothing, accepted the decision. They sailed north instead. This was not submission. This was the system working exactly as designed. The articles that governed these ships covered everything. They specified how plunder would be divided. The captain typically received 2 shares. The quartermaster and key officers, slightly more than 1, everyone else 1. And these divisions were known before anyone signed on. They set out rules for gambling because gambling debts created violence and violence cost men, and men were the most valuable resource a pirate ship had. They specified punishments for theft from the common stock. Marooning, which meant being put ashore on the nearest deserted island with a bottle of water, a pistol, and 1 shot. The implied purpose of that single shot was understood by everyone. These were not gentle people. The democracy in the Articles coexisted with a punishment system that was swift and often savage. But the cruelty was functional, not arbitrary, which distinguished it sharply from the naval discipline of the era, where a captain might flog a man simply because he was in a bad mood, or for failing to maintain adequate deference, or for looking at an officer the wrong way. On a pirate ship, you were punished for specific violations of specific rules that you had agreed to before you signed. This distinction mattered enormously to the men who lived under it. Now let's talk about what life actually looked like, because the gap between the mythology and the reality is enormous, and the reality is, in many ways, more interesting. The average pirate woke up around sunrise, not because of a schedule, but because the quartermaster would physically kick or shout anyone still sleeping as daylight arrived. Daylight was navigational time and maintenance time, and wasting it was not a luxury they had. The first meal of the day was not what anyone would call breakfast. It was hardtack, a biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, baked to a consistency that could genuinely break teeth if you bit directly into it. Standard procedure was to soak it first, in watered-down beer or rum, until it softened enough to chew without dental injury. Alongside this came salted meat, beef or pork, preserved in brine to the point where the flavor was essentially salt with a memory of having once been an animal. This was every morning. This was many middays. This was often dinner. Scurvy was the invisible enemy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. It begins with fatigue and weakness, progresses to bleeding gums, then to reopening of old wounds, and finally to death. Sailors had noticed for decades that fresh fruit prevented it, without understanding why. Smart pirate captains would raid coastal plantations for limes, oranges, and lemons with nearly as much urgency as they chased merchant ships for gold. A crew with scurvy was a crew that couldn't fight. It was an existential threat in the most literal sense. Water was treated as more precious than treasure. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels would gradually go foul, developing algae turning brown, acquiring a smell that made it nearly undrinkable even when you desperately needed to drink. Records from captured pirate vessels document cases of crews tracking their water consumption down to the cup. One account from 1718 describes a pirate crew that executed 3 of their own men for secretly consuming extra water rations during a 2-week stretch with no rain and no land in sight. 3 men executed for drinking water. When you understand how close to the edge these ships constantly operated, the severity becomes comprehensible, if not exactly forgivable. The deck required constant maintenance. Wooden ships in tropical waters were in a perpetual slow war against the ocean. Seawater, sun, and salt dried out planking, opened seams, let in moisture that accelerated rot. Crews scrubbed the deck with holystones, soft sandstone blocks, on hands and knees, using seawater as an abrasive. This could take hours under the full Caribbean sun. The phrase, "between the devil and the deep blue sea," originated from this work. The devil was the lowest and longest seam in the ship's wooden planking, the hardest to reach, the hardest to clean, the one you were most likely to be trapped between and the ocean. Sails required even more constant attention. Canvas took a relentless beating from wind, salt, and tropical storms. Pirates regularly inspected for tears, reinforced weak spots, applied tallow and tar for waterproofing. A ship with damaged sails could not pursue targets, could not escape warships, was essentially dead in the water. Many pirates became highly skilled with a needle and thread, a fact they were careful not to advertise. One account describes a pirate who, when his captain mentioned his needlework skill to the crew, responded that the captain should let the men believe I have killed 15 men with my cutlass, not 3 hours spent darning the mainsail. Weapons required daily maintenance too. Salt air corrodes metal at a pace that is almost impossible to appreciate unless you've seen it. A pistol left unattended for a week in tropical humidity could become inoperable. Crews spent hours cleaning and oiling firearms, sharpening blades, and, critically, managing gunpowder. Gunpowder absorbs moisture. Wet powder doesn't fire. Some crews rotated portions of their powder supply daily, bringing it up from below to dry in the sun and returning it before the evening dew could settle. This was not optional. Wet powder in a fight meant death. Bathroom facilities were called the head, the front of the ship, where openings in the bowsprit allowed crew members to hang over the ocean and conduct their business directly into the sea below. In calm weather, this was merely undignified. In rough weather, it was life-threatening. No one bathed in any meaningful sense. Some pirates stripped during rainstorms to rinse off accumulated salt. Some used sand and seawater as a rough abrasive. Most did neither. The resulting smell was so consistent and so powerful that accounts from the era routinely describe merchant ships detecting pirate vessels by scent before sighting them. One captured merchant captain wrote in 1718 that he surrendered not due to the pirates' weapons, but because their approach had already announced itself at 100 yards. Sleep happened in shifts, typically 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, in hammocks slung in the hold, or simply on deck if the weather was tolerable. Privacy did not exist. Personal space was the hammock and a small wooden chest that held everything you owned. In that chest might be a spare shirt, a knife, some coins, perhaps a letter from someone you had once known. That was a life. That was what a pirate actually had. Against all of this, the terrible food, the physical danger, the constant labor, the smell, you had to set the alternative. For escaped enslaved people, the alternative was recapture and slavery. For deserters from naval vessels, it was hanging. For men who had fled debt or conviction, it was the prison or the gallows. For former sailors who had simply been cheated and abused for years by naval officers with absolute power over them, it was going back to a world that treated them as barely human. Piracy, for all its genuine horror, offered something specific: a vote, a share, and the knowledge that if the captain made a decision you believed would get you killed, you could stand up and say so. Now let's talk about how they actually operated, because the image of pirates as random opportunists who sailed around attacking whatever they encountered is almost entirely wrong. Pirates were strategists. The Caribbean and Atlantic of the 1700s were vast, and simply sailing around hoping to encounter a rich merchant was a reliable path to starvation. Successful pirate operations ran on intelligence. Before any voyage, captains cultivated networks of informants in port towns. Corrupt harbor officials could be paid for shipping schedules. Tavern keepers overheard conversations between sailors and merchants. Some legitimate businessmen and court records from the 1720s implicate roughly 20% of captured pirates' operations involved some connection to legal commerce, quietly passed along information about valuable cargo in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. One pirate at his trial, when asked about this relationship, remarked that the only real difference between himself and the merchants who informed for him was that he admitted to stealing. The judge sentenced him to hang. The merchants went home for dinner. Maps were critical, but not treasure maps. Pirate navigational charts showed shipping lanes, seasonal wind patterns, patrol schedules, and, crucially, the depth a fully loaded merchant vessel would sit in the water versus an empty one. A ship riding low in the water was heavy with cargo. A ship riding high was not worth taking. These charts also marked the locations of sheltered coves and shallow coastal waters where pirate vessels could hide and repair, places a pursuing naval warship with deeper draft could not follow. The choice of hunting ground was not random. Pirates identified choke points, narrow passages where geography forced shipping to converge, regardless of destination. The windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola funneled ships from Europe toward Jamaica. The waters off Charleston channeled vessels along the American colonial coast. The straits near the Bahamas caught ships returning to Europe loaded with colonial goods. Positioning at these bottlenecks transformed the hunt from a lottery into something closer to a fishing operation. You knew where the fish would be and when. Timing mattered equally. Sugar from the Caribbean sailed for Europe in late summer. Slave ships crossed to the Americas in spring. East India Company vessels returned from Asia in early fall, laden with spices, silk, and the kind of cargo that could make a crew wealthy. A pirate captain who understood these cycles could position his ship to intercept the richest prizes at the moments of maximum vulnerability, far from their home ports, days or weeks from any naval protection, carrying everything they had. The vessels themselves were chosen for specific purposes. The Hollywood image of massive cannon-heavy ships is mostly fantasy. Most successful pirates sailed small, fast, highly maneuverable sloops and brigantines, vessels that could run down fleeing merchants and escape pursuing warships in shallow coastal waters, where naval frigates could not follow. One of the most feared pirate ships, captured in 1718, measured just 65 feet in length, smaller than many modern recreational yachts. It had taken over 40 prizes. What it lacked in size, it compensated for with extra sails for speed bursts, a shallow keel for coastal navigation, and the ability to pack in enough men to overwhelm a merchant crew by sheer numbers on boarding. The approach was choreographed. A pirate vessel would fly a friendly or neutral flag, whatever nationality was least likely to alarm the target, until close enough to make evasion impossible. Only then would they raise the black flag. The black flag, and here's something important, was not primarily a symbol of violence. It was a business communication. It said, "You cannot escape. We have you. But surrender now, and we will deal with you according to our codes. Fight us, and we will stop being reasonable." The black flag was the offer. The red flag, in which pirates also flew, meant the offer had expired. The imagery on these flags was chosen with deliberate psychological intent. Hourglasses said, "Your time is running out." Skeletons said, "You are already dead." Swords and bleeding hearts said, "We have done this before and we will do it again without particular distress." The goal was to create surrender before contact. Every ship that struck its colors without a fight was a ship where no one got shot, no cargo got damaged, and the entire operation resolved itself in an hour, with minimal risk to anyone. Pirates preferred this outcome strongly. A dead merchant sailor cannot tell you where the next shipment is coming from. A warning shot across the bow accompanied the flag reveal. If the merchant still didn't strike its colors, pirates would aim at rigging, sails, and masts rather than the hull. Damaging the cargo was economically counterproductive. A ship with destroyed sails is immobilized, unable to run or fight, but its hold is intact. Once immobilized, grappling hooks on ropes would be thrown across to lock the ships together, and boarding would begin. Boarding was controlled chaos designed to look like absolute chaos. Pirates understood intuitively what modern psychological research would eventually confirm: that terror is often more effective than actual violence. When they came over the rails, they came screaming, in costume, painted with slow-burning fuses woven into their beards and hair so that smoke surrounded their faces. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, armed with cutlasses and boarding axes and multiple loaded pistols, not because they were accurate, but because the sheer number of weapons created the impression of infinite threat. One captured merchant sailor recalled that he surrendered not because the pirates could shoot well, but because they could miss 6 consecutive times before he had an opportunity to fire once. The cutlass was the weapon of choice, not out of tradition, but out of practicality. In the cramped conditions of a ship deck, where you cannot backswing, where you might trip over a coil of rope or a cannon carriage, a short, broad, slightly curved blade that requires no technique to be lethal was exactly right. Naval officers with elegant dueling swords were at a significant disadvantage fighting men with cutlasses in spaces where the elegant sword was useless. The boarding axe served double duty, a combat weapon and a tool for breaking down locked cabin doors, where officers sometimes barricaded themselves with the ship's papers and the captain's private valuables. Most shipboard battles lasted less than 15 minutes. The goal was not a prolonged fight, but a swift demonstration of inevitable defeat. If the defenders believed resistance was futile, they stopped resisting. If they kept fighting, people died on both sides and cargo got damaged. Neither outcome was desirable. The ideal pirate raid resulted in no casualties, a complete transfer of valuable goods, and perhaps the voluntary recruitment of skilled sailors from the captured crew. Those who surrendered quickly were usually treated reasonably well by the standards of the era. Common sailors might be allowed to keep personal possessions and were often released at the next port. Officers who had treated their crews badly, and pirates would ask the common sailors about this directly, sometimes fared much worse. Sadistic officers were occasionally flogged using their own instruments of punishment, which pirates evidently found poetically satisfying. Crews that had fought fiercely could face marooning. People who had committed specific offenses, theft from the common stock, for instance, were punished according to the articles they had signed. Roughly 35% of pirates, according to colonial court records, began their careers as pirates after being captured. They simply decided that the pirate life was preferable to whatever they had been doing before. Some of these voluntary converts became the most committed members of their new crews. They had nothing to go back to, and they knew it. Now the question everyone eventually asks about piracy: what happened to the money? The answer is almost uniformly the same. It disappeared. The mythology of buried treasure is one of the most persistent and least accurate images associated with pirates. Only 2 authenticated instances of buried pirate treasure have ever been documented. Real pirates spent their money. They spent it quickly and enthusiastically in the port towns that tolerated their presence. Nassau in the Bahamas, Tortuga in the Caribbean, Madagascar off the African coast. They spent it on rum, on gambling, on clothes, on women, on the simple pleasure of buying things after months of deprivation at sea. A pirate crew that had taken a rich prize might arrive in port with enough wealth to live comfortably for years and be broke within a week. This was not unusual. This was, in many ways, the point. Walking the plank, that staple of pirate fiction, appears in 0 contemporary accounts. Not one, it was invented. Real pirates who wanted to kill someone threw them overboard. It was faster, more practical, and accomplished the same result without any of the theatrical apparatus of a plank. The pirate who wanted drama could simply toss the man over the rail and get on with their day. The famous wooden leg and the parrot are mostly mythological as standard pirate equipment. Prosthetic limbs were expensive, custom-made items available only to men of significant means, not a standard feature of pirate life. Parrots were valuable trade commodities worth several months of wages, the equivalent of a luxury sports car in terms of relative cost. Most pirates could not afford to keep one as a pet. The stereotypes we have inherited were invented largely by 19th century novelists and artists who had access to dramatic accounts and no particular obligation to accuracy. Perhaps the most uncomfortable myth concerns pirate brotherhood. Nearly 60% of pirate captains captured during the Golden Age were turned in by members of their own crew seeking clemency or reward money. The famous pirate codes about honor and loyalty and standing by your brothers were real and regularly violated the moment the alternative was the gallows. Human nature, it turns out, does not transform entirely just because you have signed an article about brotherhood. The legal proceedings against captured pirates were not exactly characterized by nuance or due process. The dedicated piracy courts, established in the early 1700s, could complete an entire trial in under 6 hours, with conviction rates approaching 95%. Most captured pirates claimed they had been forced into service against their will, a defense that occasionally worked, particularly if they could produce witnesses from their former life, but usually did not. The executions were spectacles. Pirates were hanged at harbor entrances, their bodies displayed in iron cages until 3 tides had passed over them, then tarred and hung in prominent locations visible from the water, a message to every ship arriving in port about what awaited those who chose this life. The irony is that even as the Golden Age of Piracy was ending, as the naval crackdown of the 1720s caught and hanged most of the major figures of the era, piracy was already becoming mythology. The first pirate-themed theatrical production opened in London in 1712, while actual pirates were still actively threatening shipping lanes. The romanticization began before the reality had finished. Within a generation, the man who had been a genuine societal threat had become an entertainment. Within 2 generations, a children's story. Within 3, a Halloween costume. What actually ended the Golden Age of piracy was not any single dramatic confrontation. It was economics and logistics, as colonial governments strengthened as naval patrols became more frequent and better coordinated, as the port towns that had tolerated pirates came under pressure to stop doing so, the operating environment for piracy deteriorated. The windows of opportunity narrowed. The intelligence networks became harder to maintain. The friendly ports disappeared one by one. The life that had offered something, a vote, a share, a rough equality, became increasingly unsustainable. The last major figure of the Golden Age was Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, who was killed in a naval engagement off the coast of West Africa in February 1722. His crew, following the articles they had signed, dressed him in his finest clothes and threw his body into the sea rather than let it fall into British hands. They did not want him displayed in an iron cage. It was the last act of the brotherhood they had built, honoring one of their own the only way they still could. Within a year, most of his crew had been captured, tried, and hanged. The courts were efficient, the cages went up, the age was over. But the thing about that document Braithwaite found nailed to the mast, the one he kept a copy of even as he prepared to hang the men who had created it, is that he kept it for a reason. Because even he understood that something real had been attempted out there. Something imperfect, brutal, violent, and in many ways, monstrous. But something that had looked at the world as it existed and decided to try to build something different. That the men who built it were outlaws and killers does not make what they built irrelevant. It makes it stranger. And stranger usually is more interesting than the version we were told. We were